Good morning, everybody. Chapter 8 today. So basically what we're going to be doing is building upon what we learned last chapter, which was consumer surplus, producer surplus, how the market's doing, and then what we learned in the chapter before that, which was taxes and price ceilings and price floors. Generally, we're going to look at taxation, and we're going to say, okay, we know from chapter 4 that the marketplace normally on its own picks a price and a quantity based upon the intersection of supply and demand curves. Then we learned in chapter 6 that when the government gets involved, stuff can get messed up, right? Especially with taxes and stuff like that. We learned from chapter 7 how to measure like the happiness or the well-being of people in the marketplace. So now chapter 8, basically, we're putting those all together and we're saying, okay, when governments tax, how better off, does it make people better off? Does it make them worse off? So we'll use the ideas of consumer surplus and producer surplus and total surplus to be able to talk about, hey, how are individuals in the marketplace doing with the presence of a tax or with the removal of a tax? All right, so we'll be able to get actual numbers. Instead of just being able to say, oh yeah, people are not as well off with a tax, we'll be able to say exactly how much worse off they are, okay? And so what you're going to look for is how the tax affects the consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus. Because remember, in this class, now maybe there's other better ways to decide how happy people are in a marketplace. That's possible, right? But in this class, the way that we're going to measure the welfare of individuals, don't forget, is consumer surplus, that's the welfare of the buyers. Producer surplus, that's the welfare of the firms or the sellers. And total surplus, we just add that all together, right? And in an efficient society, efficient means there's no way to make more total surplus than there is, right? If I'm at the point where there's maximum total surplus, that's efficient, okay? So we're going to say, how does the tax affect all those notions? Then I'm going to introduce this idea called the deadweight loss. This is basically like the loss that's imposed to society from a tax. How do we make this deadweight loss? This is a bad thing, by the way. Kind of sounds like a bad thing. Right? How do we determine the size of the deadweight loss? And then finally, we'll talk about the idea of tax revenue. That is the reason that governments put a tax on a marketplace in the first place, right? They're not just trying to ruin the marketplace for all of the participants. They're actually trying to get revenue out of it so that they can function. And so we'll talk about how tax revenue depends on the size of the tax. Okay? So let's do a slight review from Chapter 6. Remember, Chapter 6 was taxes and government policies. So focusing on the taxes, how do we analyze taxes in the marketplace? First question, does it matter if we impose the tax on the buyer or the seller? No, it doesn't matter, right? Okay, so whether I put the tax on the buyer, okay, and so we interpret that as a decrease in demand, all right, we'll call that D prime, or we put the tax on the seller, the supply curve going up, and then we kind of think of that like a decrease in supply, we got the same outcome, right? That the price the buyers pay was higher, the price the sellers got at the end of the day was lower, and the quantity decreased, right? So instead of doing either of these, remember the best way to analyze taxes in the marketplace is to draw the original equilibrium point, right? Find on the side, because this is price, this is quantity, so this is in dollars, right? Find the height of the tax from this axis, and then slide it in, right, and bump it to you hit the supply and demand curve. Then I know that this is my new quantity with a tax. This was my old quantity. I'll call it QE for the equilibrium quantity, the quantity that wants to be sold, right? This was the equilibrium price, but nobody gets the equilibrium price anymore. This is the price the buyers pay. This is the price the sellers get. And so the two big kind of aha moments that we saw in Chapter 6 is one, It doesn't matter if you make the buyer or the seller pay the tax at the end of the day, right? What really matters is what we call the incidence of the tax, or how much people are hurt by the tax. And do you remember who gets hurt more by a tax? How do you determine who gets hurt more? You guys remember? It's the person with the more inelastic curve. So whoever has the more inelastic curve is the one that's going to be hurt more by the tax, right? Because inelastic means you can't change quantity, means you can't get out of the marketplace. So if the government imposes a tax, you're stuck in there and you're stuck paying the tax, okay? So basically, here's the summary, right? You got the tax wedge between the price the buyers pay and the price the sellers get at the end of the day. The price buyers pay goes up. That's the incidence of the tax on the buyers. The price the sellers get goes down. That's the incidence of the tax on the sellers. And it reduces the quantity bought and sold, right? This is the equilibrium quantity, and then the tax quantity is lower. All right. So again, the thing you have to remember, the effect is the same whether we charge or we make the buyers pay the check to the government at the end of the day, or we make the sellers pay the tax on the end of the day. A couple of words that's used to describe putting the tax on someone is if they impose the tax, or also another word that can be used is if they levy the tax. All of those are being used to describe the person who actually sends the check to the government. Remember, it's different than who's hurt by the tax. Okay. So let's just go ahead and remember what a tax looks like. So equilibrium with no tax, right? Equilibrium price, equilibrium quantity, right? That's very simple. That's from chapter 4. Now, add some taxes in here. Let's say the tax is $T tall. So I take $2 and I slide it in, and I hit at $T, right? And so the buyers are paying PB. It goes up because they have to pay a tax. The sellers get PS because they don't quite get everything the buyers pay, because part of what the buyers pay is going to the government. Exactly $T is going to the government, so that's the distance between these two, right? And sellers receive PS. And now the new quantity is QT. We'll call that quantity with the tax, which is always less than the equilibrium quantity. You see that? And that makes sense, right? When we make a good more expensive because we add a tax in there, fewer people can buy it, right? So the quantity is always less. Okay. Now, let's see what the benefit of this tax is, right? Why do governments impose taxes? Well, it's to raise tax revenue, right? So how much tax revenue are they getting from this marketplace? Well, this is kind of simple. QT products are being sold, right? Maybe this is 20, 30, 40, I don't know, right? And how much is the government getting from each product? It's getting $T, right? So if I take $T times QT products, that's the size of the revenue that the government's getting. It also, so T times QT, it also geometrically happens to be the area of this rectangle, right? Because this is the width, QT, and this is the height, T. So QT times T is the area of this rectangle, right? So we can express it mathematically with this number. We can express it geometrically with this guy right here, okay? What was I going to say about that? And we'll come back to that. Okay, so let's use welfare economics to see how this tax affected the society. Remember, welfare, not talking about cash transfers from the government to low-income individuals. Welfare as in, how are people faring? Are they faring well? Are people doing well? Okay. So in order to do that, what's our tools? The only tools that we know for welfare analysis in this class? Consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus, right? That's the only current way we know how to measure how good people are doing. Maybe there's other ways to measure, it's true, but we're only going to use this, okay? And it's also important to note that tax revenue, we're going to think of it as a good thing. Why is tax revenue a good thing? Well, in a perfect world, what does the government use its tax revenue for? To build roads or schools or things like that, right? So to build public goods. So we're going to include tax revenue in total surplus, like total happiness of the marketplace, because, hopefully, right, the government's taking the tax revenue and then investing it in essential public services, like water or sewer or something like that. Stuff that makes everybody happier anyway, right? So we're going to include it in total surplus, so don't get surprised. The actual tax revenue itself is considered a good thing. Okay. So let's look at this. Let's go ahead and label this ABCDEF so we can see what's going on here. What was the old consumer surplus without a tax? You can either tell me the letters or where it is found or anything. How do you find the consumer surplus without a tax? A, B, and C is the old consumer surplus, right? The consumer surplus, don't forget, is everything below the demand curve, above the price, from 0 to Q, right? And who remembers what consumer surplus kind of measures? What does it tell us? Exactly. So it tells us the dollar value of the happiness left over in people's heart after they buy something, right? So this guy right here, whoever he is, I don't know, person X, he'll pay up to this price for the good, but because it's a competitive marketplace, he doesn't have to pay this so much money. He pays the price, because everyone pays the price. So there's like extra happiness left over in his heart. That's the dollar value of it. Okay, so we sum that all up. That's the happiness of all the consumers of being in the marketplace. Okay, so there's consumer surplus. Producer surplus, very much the same, right? Just opposite. So producer surplus, well, it's kind of easy, but you can see where it is. It's D, E, and F, right? Producer surplus is always above the supply curve, below the price, from 0 to Q. Okay, so it's this green triangle here. Okay. In the same fashion, what does producer surplus represent? Remember, what does producer surplus represent? So I'll give you a hint. Remember, the supply curve is basically the listing of the minimum price people would make the good for, right? Because these are the firms. So this is their costs, right? So it's the minimum amount. So this guy right here, whoever this seller is, it's going to cost him that many dollars to produce the good, yet he gets to sell it for that many dollars because it's the equilibrium price, right? So the difference between the amount that he's getting for his product minus his costs, that's kind of like his leftover profit or something like that. We can think about it. If this incorporates all of his costs, then we can think of it as his profit. Okay? So this is way, I think, easier to think about in our brains. It's for the firm, it's the difference between the price they sell at and their costs. It's kind of like their profit, the money left over at the end of the day that they get to keep. Okay? So clearly that's a good way, I think, to measure how happy the firms are to be in the marketplace, right? The difference between what they buy and their costs for making the product. Okay, so we have the producer surplus. Yes, good. Everybody got that? Now let's throw a tax in there. Okay. Oh, and yeah, in the present, when there's no tax, so there's no tax revenue. So we don't count that into total surplus. So total surplus is equal to what in this marketplace? Total surplus. A, B, C, D, E, F. It's everything here, right? So everything here, and we're not going to bother putting numbers on it because we can do this geometrically a little bit easier, right? It's just this big, huge triangle here. Total surplus is everything, okay? And basically the idea here is that total surplus is the total gains in the marketplace from engaging in trade, right? The total increase in welfare from participating in this trade is incorporated by this big triangle. Because this is an equilibrium, we're at PE and QE, and we don't have a government involved or anybody messing this up, we also know that this is the maximum total surplus you could possibly have, right? So we call that efficient, right? PE and QE is the efficient place to sell, the efficient amount and quantity to sell, because everybody is the maximum happy that they could possibly be. Okay? That makes sense? Now, keeping in mind what the pre-tax equilibrium or the no-tax equilibrium is, now let's introduce the tax and see what happens. Okay? So remember, the tax is $T high, so it goes in right here, right? Okay? So this is price the buyer pays. This is the price the seller gets. Can you look at this and And reason in your brain where the new consumer surplus is going to be with a tax. It'll be just A. Why? Right, so we have this tax wedge coming in here, right? Remember, how much do the buyers pay? They pay this much right here. How many are being sold? QT now. We're not selling QE, equilibrium quantity. We're only selling QT because the tax reduced it, okay? So everything above the price, below the demand curve from 0 to Q, it's this guy right here, okay? So the happiness in society is now smaller. We've lost B and C, okay? And remember, why did we lose B and C? Well, when the price goes up, two things happen. First of all, fewer people buy the product, right? And so that's incorporated from the difference between QE and QT. These people, the people between QE and QT, they dropped out of the marketplace, right? So this C was their happiness from being in the marketplace. It is no more because they dropped out. B we lose because although 0 to QT people are still in the marketplace, they're all paying a higher price, okay? So that's why we lose B. So consumer surplus is A. What's producer surplus with the tax? It's just F. The same exact reasoning, right? The sellers are getting fewer dollars now, so fewer sellers are willing to pay, or willing to produce, so we only have QT producers. And the difference between the price that they sell it at and their cost is this area here, it's F. We've lost D and E. Why did we lose D and E? What's E? E is the loss from what? How did E go away? People dropping out of the market, right? So when the price fell from the equilibrium price to PS, not everybody can produce that cheaply. So all of the producers between QE and QT, in other words, all of these people along the supply curve, they dropped out. So E is the loss in happiness, or the loss in profit from the people who had to drop out. D, where's that loss coming from? So it's from these people, the 0 to QT people. Exactly. So these are it's a loss in profit or happiness or producer surplus from the drop in price. These people, 0 to QT, are still in the marketplace, even at the lower price, right? But they're just not receiving quite as many dollars for their product. Okay, so producer surplus is F. Where's tax revenue? How can I find tax revenue? It would be B and D. Everybody see that? Because how much is the tax? Well, it's the difference between PB and PS, right? The difference between the tax is PB and PS. Because why don't the buyers and the sellers, why isn't the amount of the sellers getting the same as the buyers paying? Well, it's because part of it's going to the government. So we know exactly this height is the tax, and we know QT products are being sold. So this is just that square, right? With a height of T and a width of QT. So it's this square right here. B and D is the tax revenue, okay? Remember, in this model, tax revenue is a good thing because they take the tax revenue and they build good things for us. So it goes in total surplus, right? So here, what is the new total surplus in the world with a tax? ABDF. Everybody see that? ABDF. And we can represent that with this big orange quadrilateral, maybe? That's the name of that shape? I don't know, quad, 4 sides. Is this total surplus bigger or smaller than the old total surplus? It's smaller, right? So in the world with no tax, I had a bigger consumer surplus. It was a bigger total surplus. It was ABCDEF. That was my total surplus. Now in a world with a tax, we knew this was coming, right? But the total surplus is smaller. It's missing C and E, okay? Remember, it's missing C and E. How did C and E go away? It's from the people who were dropping out. Remember, those are from the people from QE to QT who couldn't afford to be in the marketplace anymore. Both the buyers and the sellers who couldn't afford to be in the marketplace anymore. So they drop out. We're losing their happiness. We're losing their surplus. Okay. So it's missing C and E. The pre-tax equilibrium total surplus was ABCDEF. The post-tax, or the with a tax equilibrium, is missing C and E. Okay? And it's missing it because those people dropped out of the market. They'd like to be in the market, but they just, and they would be in the market if they could just interact directly with the buyers and the sellers. But if you add this third guy that you have to pay the government, they now all of a sudden can't afford it. Okay? So we're going to call C and E the dead weight loss, DWL for short. Okay? And so it has a really bad name because we want to remind us that, oh, that's a bummer, right? This is the loss in happiness that is just stolen from the market when I impose the tax. And nobody gets it back, right? It just evaporates into the air and nobody can ever benefit from this. So almost any time we have the government being imposed into a market that's working all right, we'll call that a market distortion. Anything that messes up the marketplace, right, from functioning perfectly, we're going to have a dead weight loss. Sometimes it'll be big, sometimes it'll be small. We'll talk a little bit about that. But we'll always have a dead weight loss. Okay? Now, just kind of going over again, where does it come from, right? Well, remember, product between QE and QT are no longer sold. QE used to be being sold. Now only QT are being sold. So both the buyers who bought these quantity and the sellers who used to buy this quantity are now out of the marketplace. And it's a bummer that they're out of the marketplace because the value of these products is up here on the demand curve. The cost of producing them is lower. Just simple intuition should tell you if somebody values something for more money than it costs to make that product, well, we should go ahead and have somebody make it and give it to that person because they value it and we'll all be better off, right? That's simple intuition. Anytime someone values something more than it costs to make it, well, let's just go ahead and do that. And that is true for these, but unfortunately they're not being sold because the tax is preventing these mutually beneficial trades, right? So like the person values it more than it costs to make it, but not a lot more, just a little bit more, right? They don't value it even more than the cost of the tax, right? So when you put the tax on the total cost, then the person's like, no, I don't value it that much anymore, so we're not going to do this trade. Okay? So we have mutually beneficial trades being prevented, called the dead weight loss, bad thing, that's why we've got a scary name for it, dead weight loss, right? We never get it back. Okay. Let's have you guys do a practice here. So we have airplane tickets, the market for airplane tickets. So we have price of airplane tickets here. We have the quantity of airplane tickets here. Remember, since these are smooth curves, this is probably in the thousands or the millions. But for the purposes of making life easier for you guys, you can just count this as like literally 50 or literally 75. Okay? And here's the questions. I want you to compute consumer surplus, producer surplus, and total surplus without the tax. This is identical to what I just walked you through, right? And then I want you to impose a $100 tax per ticket. Notice I don't tell you who pays the tax. Why not? It doesn't matter, right? I want you to compute the consumer surplus, producer surplus, tax revenue, total surplus, and deadweight loss from the tax. Okay? All right, let's look at what we got going on here. So first, with no tax, what's the value of the consumer surplus, and where would I find it? What do I got? 10,000. Sounds good to me. How did you find that? Very good. So you take the equilibrium point, you realize quantity is 100, and then price is here. The height then is 200, so 100 times 200 times 1/2, 10,000. Very good. What's the producer surplus, and where do you find it? / how do you find it? Same way, just opposite, right? There's 100 things being sold. It's down here. And you have producer surplus 1/2, 200 times 100. Hey, don't think that the consumer surplus and producer surplus always have to be the same number. They don't, right? If I just made these curves, bend up or down more, I could make it where there's a huge consumer surplus and a tiny producer surplus or something like that, right? It's just for the purposes of making this an easy problem, I just have really straight lines that have the exact same but opposite slopes. So it's just very simple, right? But the consumer surplus and producer surplus could be two different numbers. Okay, in this case, they're not. Is there any tax revenue in this situation? No, because there's no tax yet. So what's the total surplus? 20,000, okay? So we know that this is an efficient allocation, meaning the maximum possible happiness that could come into the marketplace for airplane tickets is 20,000. Right? We can't make more happiness surplus dollars things, right? We just can't. Okay, let's go ahead and put in a tax. With a $100 tax, it doesn't matter who I put it on, so we're going to go ahead and deal with it with the tax wedge, right? So I go over here and I find how tall $100 is. It's this tall, right? I take and I slide in until it hits. That's right there. Okay, so this is going to be my new tax equilibrium. Okay, price the buyers pay $250, but sellers only get to keep $150 of it because $100 goes to the government. They only sell 75 tickets. So right away we know that some bad things happen in the marketplace. Let's quantify it with dollar value how worse off the marketplace is. Okay, so consumer surplus is right here. Okay, so we have what's this, 150 tall on this triangle, 75 wide. 1/2 times 150 times 75 is 5625, right? That's in consumer surplus. Producer surplus, once again, is this area right just down here. And it happens to be the same. It doesn't always have to be the same. Remember, it's just to make this problem easier. It is the same. Okay, but now we have a new piece. What do we have going on here now? Well, we have taxes. So that means the government's getting some taxes, and with the tax money, it's building parks for us and schools. So we're happy about it. What's the value of the happiness I get from the taxes? How do we find that? How do I find the value of the tax revenue? Right, so it's the quantity being sold, so 75 tickets, and the government's getting $100 per ticket times 75 tickets, right? So it should be $7,500. Yep, 100 tickets times, $100 times 75 tickets is $7,500. So that's fine too, because that still makes me happy. I still get $7,500 worth of parks and roads and schools, so I'm happy about that. But what is the big issue in this marketplace with the tax? What's the big problem? The deadweight loss. And where do I find it? Right here, right? And so how do I find the dollar value of that deadweight loss? Well, there's two ways. One, I could say, hey, how much total surplus is there now? 18,750, right? I just added up all of these, right? 18,750. So the total amount of happiness in the marketplace is 18,750. What was the old surplus? 20,000, right? So the difference between the two is 1,250, I think, right? So that's one way to figure out the deadweight loss. The other way is you can just figure out the area of this triangle using 1/2 base times height, right? So you can look at it's 100 high, it's, what's that, 25 wide. 1/2 times 100 times 25 is also 1,250, okay? Regardless of the way you look at it, the economy or the marketplace is worse off by exactly $1,250 of surplus, right? It's kind of hard to think about, because there's not actually that many missed out on dollars, because some of the dollars are in happiness in people's hearts that people aren't having, right? So it's not like there's actually that many dollars that are being missed out upon, but this means that the dollar value of all the benefits in this marketplace was reduced by $1,250. Okay? So it's a bummer. Deadweight loss. It's a big bummer with taxes. Okay? What determines the size of the deadweight loss? Any ideas? If you look at this graph right here of taxes, this is the deadweight loss. How could I make this deadweight loss bigger and or smaller? One, change elasticities, right? What if I made the curves super, what is this? Elastic, right? If I made them super elastic, then this high of a tax, look at this, watch. Boom, it hits way out here. Do you guys see that? It hits way earlier. And so I have a giant deadweight loss when I have different elasticities. Okay, so that's one thing to think about. What's the other one? And this is very simple. Change the size of this deadweight loss. Change the size of the tax. Right? If I make a bigger tax, it's going to make this triangle bigger. If I make a smaller tax, it's going to make it smaller. Okay, let's explore that a little more in depth. So, here's a question we should ask, right? If I know that putting a tax on a marketplace creates a deadweight loss and that's a bad thing, are there some marketplaces, maybe this one, where the deadweight loss is small, and this one, the marketplace, the deadweight loss is huge? So the government, if they had a choice between the two, which one should they tax? The one that's going to mess up society the smallest, right? If government has a choice. So that's a question we're asking, right? The government has to tax somewhere because it has to get revenue. So where should it tax? Is there a way to make the deadweight loss smaller? Okay? And yeah, and that's where we want to tax, is the ones with the smallest deadweight loss. So what makes the difference between the deadweight loss, small or large? Price elasticities, right here. This guy versus this guy, right? This is very elastic. This is just like normal, maybe unit elastic. This is very elastic. Okay? All right, so what does price elasticity mean? It measures how much quantity demand or quantity supply changes when price changes. Okay? So think about this for a second. Remember, the deadweight loss comes from people dropping out of the marketplace because they can't afford it anymore, right? However, or I guess comma and, price elasticity tells us how easy it is for people to change their quantities, right? How easy it is for people to buy more or to buy less and drop out of the market, right? So if the problem with the deadweight loss is people dropping out of the marketplace, if I can tax a marketplace where people can't drop out, then I won't have as big of a deadweight loss, right? I might not have any deadweight loss if no one can drop out, right? And so if no one can drop out at all, that's called inelastic, right? Either supply or demand, because nobody can change their quantity. Okay, so let's look at this. This demand curve is sort of elastic, and the supply is inelastic, right? Supply is really steep, okay? Don't forget, along a linear demand curve, the elasticity is changing, so you can't. It's not the same elasticity all the way through all the way through the whole curve. But in general, look, no matter how much you change the price along the supply curve, the quantity changes very little. So the Q over the P, changing Q over changing P, the changing Q is going to be small. The number is going to be small. It's going to be close to 0. We call it inelastic, right? It's hard to change your quantity. Okay, so remember, when it's inelastic, that means firms can't change their quantity. They can't make more, but also they can't make less. They can't leave the marketplace for some reason. Okay? And so this is a good thing, because deadweight loss is caused by people saying, ooh, I can't be in this marketplace anymore, right? So if we tax a market where people can't leave, then we have less deadweight loss problems. So supply curve really inelastic like that? Well, let's see. Let's imagine that previous example of ours with the yacht builders, right? And the yacht builders can only build one boat at a time, and they have contracts maybe many years out. Maybe for the next 10 years they're scheduled to build boats, right? Well, if the tax changes, the builders, the yacht builders, are still forced to keep building those boats, right? They can't change their quantity supply. Okay, so that's maybe an example of straight up and down curve. Another one is maybe like an oil refinery. A big oil company builds a giant oil refinery, and then basically you turn it on and it just stays on, or you can't really change the amount of quantity being produced, perhaps. It was a big, huge capital investment, so you can't like run the refinery at like 50%, or you can't run it at 110%. You can only turn it on or off, right? So maybe something like that. Or I think nuclear power is a lot like that too. Like you turn a nuclear power plant either on or off. You can't run it at like 10%, 20%, 30%, that sort of thing. So this is kind of a good thing, right? If people can't leave the market, then for deadweight loss, it's really good. So the tax only reduces quantity a little, and deadweight loss is small. See that? But on the flip side, who gets hurt more by a tax? Who gets hurt more by a tax? The more inelastic person. So who's getting hurt more right now? Suppliers. So on the plus side, we hardly have a deadweight loss, right? On the negative side, it's mostly the suppliers that are bearing the incidence of the tax, right? The suppliers are being hurt more than the buyers. Okay. Now let's change that supply curve and make it very elastic, right? The more elastic is supply, then the tax wedge is going to bump at an earlier spot. It's not going to be able to get quite down in there. It's going to bump earlier. And intuitively, what does this mean? Elasticity of supply means that firms can go ahead and get out of the marketplace and stop selling. Well, when people stop selling, that's what creates a deadweight loss. Whoops, wrong direction. So the deadweight loss is way bigger than it was before, right? Because quantity is falling below the equilibrium quantity. And so the bigger is deadweight loss. So on the negative side, big deadweight loss when we have elastic supply. Maybe on the positive side is that at least the sellers aren't bearing all of the burden of this tax, right? They're splitting the burden of the tax half and half between the buyers and the sellers. Okay. So let's think about elasticity of demand now. So here I have a really inelastic demand curve, right? So this means that people have to buy the good no matter what, right? So our examples are like diabetes medication, insulin, right, for diabetics or something like that. Maybe HIV medication, maybe gas. This week I have to drive a certain amount every week, right? So I'm very inelastic. So when demand is inelastic, can people change their quantity? Can they drop out of the marketplace? No, that's the whole point of inelastic, right? People can't leave the market, so if they can't leave the market, we're going to have a small deadweight loss. Because the deadweight loss comes from people who are dropping out of the marketplace, and so if people can't drop out of the marketplace, then we have a small deadweight loss. So plus side, small deadweight loss. Negative side, who's paying all the incidence of the tax here? The consumers, the demanders, the buyers, right? Because they have the more inelastic curve, right? But let's go ahead and relax that demand curve and make it more elastic. So here it is. Now it's a different good. Maybe this is peanut butter and jelly sandwiches or something, where you can change your quantity a lot easier. The tax wedge is going to bump at an earlier spot, right? Because buyers can leave the market and stop buying. So deadweight loss is huge. Right? Sorry, deadweight loss is huge. At least the buyers and sellers are kind of equally splitting the incidence of the tax, sort of. But the deadweight loss is huge on this one. So in general, the government should tax which kind of marketplaces? Yeah, and it'd be even better if you could find a marketplace where both demand and supply are both super inelastic. If you could find a marketplace like this, you should tax the heck out of it, right? Because then you can get all your tax revenue from this marketplace, right? Gasoline, right? Oil refineries, I told you, that can't really be turned on or off, or they can only be turned on or off. They can't change their quantity, so supply is very up and down demand curve. Demand just for gasoline, at least in the short run, people buy the same amount of gas every day, right? This would be a good place to tax, it would seem like, the market for gasoline. Hey, is gasoline market taxed heavily, especially in California? Oh, yeah. What do we pay? We pay like 39 cents a gallon to federal tax, and then California jumps in, and we pay like 19 cents to California, and then Orange County, or whatever your county is, we pay, I don't know, another 9 cents to them. Everybody's jumping on and adding gasoline taxes because it's a good place to add taxes, right? It doesn't mess up the marketplace that much. So here's maybe one example of a place where they listen to economists, or they listen to their economics teachers. I don't know. So here's what I want you guys to think about, and then we'll talk about this. Would the deadweight loss of a tax be larger if the tax was on breakfast cereal or sunscreen? You probably recognize these examples from the elasticity chapter, right? Hotel rooms in the short run or hotel rooms in the long run? Groceries or meals at fancy restaurants? Whoops, thought there was one more. Okay, this should take you just a couple minutes. Let's do that. All right. Let's think. Question A. Would the tax be larger if the tax were on breakfast cereal or sunscreen? Why? Why cereal? I agree, cereal. Why? Way more elastic, right? If I tax breakfast cereal, people are going to find substitutes. That means people are going to drop out of the market. Going to be a big deadweight loss. Yeah, I can think of it graphically. The demand curve is going to be much more flat, right? It'll be more elastic. Very good. Okay, so don't forget sunscreen. People are going to buy sunscreen no matter what, right? The example I gave back in chapter 5, right? You're in Cabo, you wake up one morning, and all of a sudden the government increased taxes on breakfast cereal and on sunscreen. And you're like, well, I'll go eat eggs or chiles rellenos or something like that, right? Because I'm in Cabo. I'm still going to go buy sunscreen, though, no matter what the tax is, right? Okay, very good. The bigger deadweight loss is on cereal. Okay, hotel rooms in the short run or the long run? What do you think? Hotel rooms in long runs? Some people say long run? Yes. Price elasticities are always, for any good, not just hotel rooms, are always bigger in the long run than in the short run, right? Because in the long run, I have more time to plan about how to change my quantity. In the short run, oh, I just need to do what I'm doing. I don't have time to plan and change, okay? So when I have bigger elasticity in the long run, that means the deadweight loss of the tax is bigger in the long run, okay? So you might be able to put a tax on hotel rooms, and today and this week, it won't create a very big deadweight loss. But if you keep that tax on the hotel rooms after like a year or two, then we're going to start seeing a big, huge deadweight loss. Does that make sense? Okay. Finally, groceries or meals at fancy restaurants? Groceries. The bigger deadweight loss? Tell me why you think is at groceries. Which one of these is it easier to stop buying? Meals at fancy restaurants, right? It's not easy to stop buying groceries. Right? So the whole thing of the deadweight loss comes in because people stop purchasing the product that they were, right? Even if there's a tax on groceries, which in California there's not, by the way, but we'll come back to that in a second. The people are going to reduce their quantity at meals at fancy restaurants, right? So the deadweight loss is going to be bigger on meals at fancy restaurants, right? So the idea here is, which one of these should you tax? Should you tax groceries or meals at fancy restaurants? Which one should you tax if you don't want to worry, if you don't want to ruin with deadweight loss? You should tax groceries, which is very interesting, and it's counterintuitive, and it's actually counter policy, California, as well as a number of states, don't charge sales tax on groceries. Why? What's the reasoning? Have you ever noticed you go to Albertsons and you buy a gallon of milk, there's no tax on it, right? If you go to a restaurant and you buy a glass of milk, there is tax on it. Why don't they have taxes on groceries? They think it's a necessity, right? I don't want to raise the prices of the tax of these products that people need anyway, right? That's one way to think about it. The other way to think about it is we should be taxing it because it won't mess up the marketplace that much, at least from the buyer's standpoint, and there will be very little deadweight loss, right? So just kind of an interesting way to think about things. Okay, so just to kind of wrap this up, which one should it tax? I kind of already talked about this. I got ahead of myself. Right, we've got to tax one of them. Should they tax groceries or meals at fancy restaurants? Well, this was what I was saying. It could be either. But if you're just looking at minimizing deadweight loss, you're actually going to want to tax the groceries. Whoops. We're actually going to want to tax the groceries to minimize deadweight loss. Now, you might be able to say, right, like, oh my goodness, we can't tax people on food. They need food or they're going to die, right? And that's a legitimate complaint too, or a legitimate insight. Okay. All right, so now that we've kind of talked about taxes and what kind of taxes are good for society and what kind of taxes are bad for society, and which marketplaces we should tax, now we're going to answer a slightly related question, which is how much should the government tax to begin with, right? Because what is known as a bigger government, so a bigger government does more things, but it also has to have higher taxes in order to pay for those things that it does, right? A smaller government does fewer things, but can have fewer taxes, right? So the idea is that even when you tax a marketplace with inelastic curves, there's still going to be some deadweight loss, right? And so if we just reduce the taxes or didn't tax those things at all, that would be another way to eliminate deadweight loss, right? So basically what we're asking is, how big should the government be? How much should they tax? Maybe they shouldn't tax that much and just be a really small government, right? And so the reason why you might want a bigger government is for more services, right? You might want free health care or better roads or better schools or free, all schooling free or something like that, including through university, right? It's something like that. But it does require more deadweight losses. So you have to play this balancing act, which is better, right? And so in a world with big deadweight losses, people are always going to be arguing for smaller governments or smaller taxes, right? And so something else we should look at is the government's biggest source of income. What's the biggest government? Our government's biggest source of income? Income taxes, right? 60% of our government's revenue, more or less, comes from income taxes, right? So we should really focus on income taxes and see how big the deadweight loss from income taxes, right? And that's the tax on labor, okay? And so for the typical worker in the United States, the marginal tax rate, meaning if I make $1 more, how much of it's going to get taxed, is 40%. That's pretty high in America, right? We don't pay 40% over all of our dollars, right? Because in case you guys don't know, the first like $10,000 you pay, you don't get taxed on at all. And then you get taxed like for the next, from 10,000 to maybe 15,000, you get taxed maybe like 15%, or it's like maybe 10 to 18,000. Then after 18,000, you get taxed at like 25%, right? For the next dollars. So for most people, they're at the point where, so this is called a progressive income tax system, where the more you make, the more you pay on those next dollars. Is about 40% for the next dollar they would make. Okay? And so, a good question. How is this killing us in terms of deadweight loss? Well, obviously it depends on the elasticity of labor supply and labor demand. Okay, so let's look at this. If labor supply is inelastic, the deadweight loss is small, right? So remember the labor market. Whoops. Remember, this is the one weird market where the suppliers are the who in the labor market. Right. Normally suppliers are the firms, right? But in the labor market, it's this one weird one. And who are the demanders? Firms. Okay, so their spots are switched, right? I have some wage right here, right? The price of labor is wage, so we call it wage. And down here, the quantity of labor, we can call it Q or we can call it L, however we want to say it, right? So we have some equilibrium wage and we have some equilibrium quantity, and then there's a tax, right? If the labor supply is inelastic, that means that really the labor supply looks like this. Okay, let's call this S prime. Then the tax, when it's imposed, it could create a very small deadweight loss. You see this deadweight loss here? The blue thing? But if it's more relaxed, if it's more elastic, then the deadweight loss is going to be bigger. It's going to be this guy over here, right? So labor supply, this is us, right? Households. Is our labor supply elastic or inelastic? I mean, it can depend on what you think, right? So basically what that would mean is, as your wage changes, how much labor do you supply, or how much do you want to work, right? As your wage changes, how much has your quantity supplied changed, right? So a lot of economists think that labor supply is inelastic, which is sort of true for the average, for your average dad that goes to work, or mom who's the primary worker in her house who goes to work and they work 40 hours a week, right? Almost no matter what wage they're going to get, they are going to work 40 hours, right? Everybody kind of works 40 hours no matter what your wage is. So that would be very inelastic, right? So for these people, it's possible that they're just going to work full-time regardless of the wage. However, some economists believe that labor taxes are really bad, make big deadweight losses, because there are some groups of workers who are elastic, all right? So the average person who goes to work 40 hours every week, probably inelastic, and probably not harmed by the taxes, right? Well, that doesn't create a big deadweight loss from those taxes, right? However, there are groups of people, like people who work overtime a lot. They can change their hours, right? They might not work 40 hours every week, okay? Or like the second income earner, right? So if the dad is the main income earner, then there's maybe the mom who works part-time on the side, or if the mom's the main income earner, the dad can work part-time on the side, or maybe it's an older person who lives in the house or something like that, right? This person, probably pretty elastic, right? So the first income earner, going to work 40 hours a week no matter what to pay the mortgage and the bills and stuff like that. But then there's somebody who might be the second income earner who's like, oh, if I can make a lot of money doing blank, I'll do it, right? If my wage goes up. If not, then I'm not going to do it, right? That's an elastic supply curve. And that means if we tax these people with an income tax for their labor, they're going to create a big deadweight loss for these individuals, right? Because the tax is going to make their income feel smaller. It's going to make them not want to work as much, okay? Also, elderly people, right? We decide whether to retire or not, probably based on the wage they're earning, I'm guessing. Also, a lot of elderly people work part-time, right? The greeters at Walmart, they're very nice people. They're just people who came out of retirement and they're working. Or, you know, sometimes they work on other jobs that are part-time. And their hours might be a function of the kind of wage that they can earn, right? So for all of these people, they probably have very elastic supply, okay? And there's also people who work, we'll call it under the table, right? Why do people work under the table? So they don't have to pay taxes at all, right? Maybe if the taxes were lower, then they would come into the above ground economy, the above the table economy, I don't know, the normal taxed economy, right? So who knows? But, okay, so that's just kind of a thought on labor income. Really, the answer to how big is the deadweight loss on labor income, it's hard to tell. probably different for different groups of people. Okay, let's talk about changing the size of the tax, because that's in essence what we're talking about, changing the size of the government. A bigger government needs to tax more, so we're going to, changing the size of the government is akin to changing the size of the tax. Okay, so policymakers often change individual taxes on individual items and products, raising some and lowering others. What happens to deadweight loss and tax revenue when taxes change? Okay, let's look at this. So, let's look at deadweight loss and the size of the tax. Let's suppose that there's a tax of $T a unit, okay, which means I get $T from the p-axis, the price axis, and I slide it in, right there, $T. We'll call that, the new equilibrium is Q1, and we have initial deadweight loss right there. Okay, so the deadweight loss is this area right here. It's very simple. You know how that works. What happens if I increase the tax? What's going to happen to the deadweight loss if I increase the tax? It's going to get bigger, right? If I double the tax, so now this, how tall is this? This is 2T. Okay? The new deadweight loss is this big triangle. Can you see that? Well, what do you know about, what do you notice about that triangle? Is this triangle twice as big as this triangle? No. It's like maybe 3 times or 4 times bigger. It depends on the elasticity of these, right? But any way you look at it, if I double the tax, right, you might think, oh, well, we'll double the deadweight loss. No, you might quadruple or times 10 the deadweight loss, depending upon the elasticities. Does that make sense? Now, what happens if I triple the tax? If I triple the tax, now look at it. This triangle is much bigger than 3 times bigger that one, right? So if you look at the full, there's the new deadweight loss is giant. Okay? So we have this idea that increasing a tax makes the deadweight loss increase at a much greater rate. So if I were to graph it, there it is. Okay, yeah. So if I were to graph it, where how big my tax is on this axis, right, and then how much of a deadweight loss is, it doesn't just kind of keep getting bigger and bigger. It starts getting really out of control really fast, the deadweight loss. You see? So you have to be really careful when you're taxing. You can't just tax like 1 or 2 items a lot, because then the deadweight loss gets out of control. Right? You can tax maybe many very, very small individual taxes, right? So when the tax increases, the deadweight loss rises even more. So when tax rates are low, it's okay to raise taxes a little bit, right? Because we're right here, and then the deadweight loss goes up a little bit, and so it doesn't harm much. But when tax rates are high, raising them is really bad, because then maybe we're way down here, and then if I raise it a little bit, the deadweight loss goes up a bunch, right? So when the tax rates are high, it's very harmful to raise taxes. When the tax rates are low, maybe it's not quite as bad to raise taxes. Okay? According to the deadweight loss idea. All right, let's talk about revenue. Now, imagine a government that has a budget deficit. It means they don't have enough revenue. It means they're spending more than the income's coming in. Let's say that many of those expenditures are too hard to cut, right? People are going to get mad because they're entitlement programs or something like that. Hey, this is starting to sound a lot like the United States, right? So what is an answer to balance the budget? Well, if you can't stop spending, what do you have to do? Get more revenue, right? So how does a government get more revenue? Well, some people might say, well, you just make the taxes higher, right? Well, let's see if that's true. So let's look at an initial tax of T. How do I find the revenue? It's just this box right here, right? T times Q. So when the tax is small, just like T is, if I made it a little bit bigger, 2T, right? The new tax revenue is going to be this box here. And you can notice that the pink box is bigger than the yellow box. right? So the government needed more money. It was charging a small amount for tax, T, right? And then it raised it to 2T, and it was making more money. Okay? Good thing if you're trying to raise money for the government. Okay. However, let's say that the government tried to raise taxes again because it needed even more money, right? So instead of going 2T, now it makes the tax 3T. So where do you find the box? It's this box right here. Now look, what do you notice? That blue box is smaller. Do you see? So as they started raising taxes, they started getting more revenue. But then as they kept raising taxes, they actually started losing tax revenue. Who can tell me what's the cause of the lost tax revenue? Like, why does it go up and then start going down again? Exactly. There's a big drop off on who's buying and selling, right? When you start making the tax too high, nobody can buy and sell anymore, so then there's just no activity in that marketplace. So even though you might get a huge tax for every item sold, there's hardly any items being sold, so the revenue is really low. Okay? And that's the idea here. So you see that the box can get bigger and bigger and bigger up to a point, and then it starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Okay? So we call that the Laffer curve, and if I go ahead and graph that, if I graph tax size and tax revenue on this axis, as I start making a bigger tax, the tax revenue goes up, right? Just because I get more money. But then as I make the tax too big, nobody purchases the products anymore, and then the tax curve goes down, or the tax revenue goes down. So it's that we call that the Laffer curve. It's named after an economist whose last name is Laffer. It's not because it's funny, haha, right? But it's an inverted U. In other words, it goes up and then it goes down. So policy implication here, if we were to say, oh, in the United States, we need to raise our tax revenue, and I ask you, what should the United States do? Because they need more tax revenue. Well, we need to know if we're on this side or if we're on this side of the Laffer curve, right? Because if I'm on this side, like let's say I'm right here, and I raise taxes, we're going to actually lose tax revenue, right? So if I'm on this side, we actually need to lower taxes to raise revenue, right? And then if you're on this side, we can raise taxes to raise revenue. I would say that most economists think we're probably over here still, okay? However, you do hear the argument all the time, and I personally hear it, right? If you just lower taxes, people will start more companies, and then the government will get more tax revenue because there's more people working, right? You hear that argument all the time? That's implicitly saying what? That we're on this side of the Laffer curve, and that we need to lower our taxes to increase our tax revenue. Does that make sense? So really, it's uncertain. I tell you, most economists think we're over here somewhere, but if we were over there, you'd have to lower the tax rate. And I would say there certainly are probably some countries that are over here that could probably increase tax revenue by lowering taxes.